The cage was warm because her body was burning. She knelt on stone worn smooth by 100 other bodies, her wrists circled by iron that had learned the shape of her bones. 3 days since they'd caught her stealing bread from the winter stores. 3 days of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that screamed from inside her throat and had nowhere to go. Her name was Sarah, though no one called her that anymore. Omegas without voice had no names, only uses. The Alpha King's dungeons smelled of rust and old straw. Torchlight carved shadows across the walls, and somewhere above, boots echoed on stone. She pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the flutter beneath her ribs that only she knew about. 4 months along. The child of a bastard prince who'd taken her in the dark after a hunt, then disappeared into war. No one would believe her if she told them. No one would care. Sarah pulled her knees closer, the chains singing against the floor. Her voice had been stolen long ago, burned out of her throat when she was 7, an act of mercy by a rival pack that wanted to break her spirit before they killed her. But the Alpha King's hunters had found her in the snow instead, half dead and worthless, and brought her to the castle to work. A decade of silence, a decade of watching the world move without her in it. Now they'd chain her for wanting to live. The dungeon door groaned. She didn't look up. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the gait of someone accustomed to obedience. A man, powerful. The scent reached her before anything else. Cedarwood, winter rain, and underneath it all, the acrid tang of old blood and older guilt. She raised her eyes. The Alpha King stood in the threshold, and the torches seemed to dim in his presence. Ezra Nightfall, a name whispered like a prayer and a curse. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a coat of iron-gray fur, his hair the color of ash over a dead fire. But it was his eyes that held her, silver blue, luminous as moonlight on water, and drowning in something she recognized because she carried it too. Regret. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the chain to her trembling hands. His jaw tightened. "Release her," he said. His voice was gravel and winter wind. The guard who'd followed him stepped forward. "Sire, she was caught." "I know what she was caught doing." He stepped into the cell, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "Release her, now." The chain fell away like it had never been real at all. Sarah didn't run. That was what surprised him most. The guard unlocked the iron, and it fell to the stone with a sound like a death knell. The Omega woman remained on her knees, unmoving, her dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls. She was thin, dangerously thin, her collarbone sharp enough to cut glass, her wrists marked with deep red lines where the chain had bitten. But there was something else, a luminescence beneath her skin, barely visible in the torchlight, a mark of the Pathfinders, those rare Omegas born with the gift of reading fate. Ezra had only encountered 2 in his lifetime. Both were dead. "You can leave," he said quietly. She didn't move, didn't make any sound. He'd heard the servants whisper about her muteness, the way she communicated in gestures, and the rare, strangled sounds that came from a throat that had been burned too young. Now, watching her shoulders rise and fall, he understood. Not all silence was emptiness, some was survival. He crouched before her, deliberately lowering his power so he wouldn't overwhelm her senses. "What is your name?" She looked at him, and her lips moved silently. "Sarah. Sarah." He held out his hand. "You're free, Sarah. You can leave the dungeons. Leave the castle if you wish." She didn't take his hand. Instead, her gaze traveled to his face, lingering on the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. A wound from the rebellion 5 years ago, when he'd chosen mercy over massacre and his own people had called him weak for it. 300 of them had died anyway. The ones he didn't save always haunted him more than the ones he did. Her hand came up slowly. She didn't take his fingers. Instead, She touched the scar with a gentleness that made something in his chest fracture. Her fingertips traced the ridge of old tissue, and Ezra felt his breath catch. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire. It was recognition. She was reading him, the way pathfinders read the world, seeing the wound beneath the wound. When she withdrew, her eyes were full of tears she couldn't cry. A guard appeared in the doorway. "Sire, there's a messenger from the Eastern Territories. The rebel encampment they've taken." "I'll be there," Ezra said, not looking away from Sarah. "See that she's given quarters in the castle, food, a healer if she'll allow it." He stood, and the moment shattered like ice beneath spring sun. "You're not a prisoner anymore, Sarah. Remember that." But as he turned to leave, he felt her hand catch the hem of his coat. He stopped, looking back. She was standing now, steadier. Her other hand moved in shapes he didn't understand, but her eyes spoke clearly. "Don't go." Not with words, but with the same intensity that had marked her touch. Something waits in that direction, something that will change you. Ezra had learned long ago not to believe in fate. He had learned to believe only in choices, in consequences, in the weight of a crown and the people it crushed. But standing there in the dungeon with this silent, burning woman, this Omega carrying a gift that should have been dead, he felt the first tremor of something he'd thought himself too broken to feel: hope. Or its cousin, terror. "I have to go," he said softly, "but I'll return. I promise you that." She released his coat, and he saw her lips move one more time, a single word shaped in the dark. "Hurry." The rebel encampment was burning when Ezra arrived, not from his command, from theirs. The Eastern Territories had always been a wound that wouldn't heal. 15 years of resistance, of raids and counter-raids, of the old families refusing to bend the knee to a king they saw as soft. Now they'd made their choice. The messenger had said they'd taken the garrison at Coldstone Pass, slaughtered 50 soldiers, and were marching toward the capital with what remained of the old royal line behind them. Ezra moved through the flames with his guard at his back, his power rolling outward in waves, the rebels scattered like insects. He was too fast, too strong, and too angry. 3 of them fell before they could draw steel. The 4th, a man with his grandfather's eyes, tried to negotiate. "The people don't want a weak king," the man spat, blood at the corner of his mouth. "They want a true alpha, one who doesn't spare his enemies." Ezra could have killed him. Should have. The old Ezra, the one who'd taken the throne with blood on his hands, would have torn him apart as a message to anyone else who might think rebellion was mercy. Instead, he saw Sarah's face in the firelight. He saw her hand touching his scar with recognition of his wound. "You're right," Ezra said quietly. "They do want that. And they'll never have it from me because I learned something that you never will." He gestured to his soldiers. "Take them, all of them, to the dungeons, yes, but see they're given water, food, a healer. They're prisoners, not corpses." His general stared at him. "Sire." "That's an order, Kale." The battle took 3 hours. By the time it ended, the rebels had scattered into the mountains, and Ezra stood in the ash of their camp with a sword in his hand and the weight of another choice pressing down on his shoulders. He'd won without slaughter. He'd proven once again that mercy could be strength. And he wanted to go home. The sun was setting when he rode back toward the castle, the sky bleeding red above the snow. His mind was already in the dungeons. Or no, not the dungeons. Wherever Sarah was now. He needed to see her, needed to know that she was real, that the moment between them hadn't been some dream born from exhaustion and guilt. But the moment he crossed the castle gates, he sensed it, a shift in the air, a wrongness. He found her in the tower they'd given her, a room high above the courtyard with windows that looked out over the frozen kingdom. She was standing at the glass, her hand pressed against the cold, and she was glowing, not metaphorically. The light came from inside her, silver and blue, the same color as his own eyes, a power that shouldn't have been possible. She turned to face him, and he saw the truth written in the curve of her body, in the way she cradled her belly. She was carrying an heir. His heir. Ezra's world tilted. "How long have you known?" She made a sound, the first sound he'd heard from her, a broken thing like a key turning in a rusted lock. Her lips shaped words, "Since before, since you found me." "The child is yours, but not by choice. I was taken." Her hands moved, sharp and angry. "They sent me to the dungeons because no one believed I was worth feeding. No one knew what I carried. No one cared." Ezra felt something inside him splinter. "I would have protected you. I would have—" "You didn't know." She stepped toward him, and the light around her brightened, casting shadows that looked almost like wings. "But the child knew. The child called to you. That's why you came to the dungeons. That's why you're standing here now." "The heir," he whispered. "Our heir," she corrected. And there was no sweetness in it, only truth, raw and unvarnished. Conceived in violence, born into a world that wanted to kill us both. And now, she paused, her hand moving to her heart. "Now you have to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether you'll love this child as a king loves an heir, or as a father loves a son. Whether you'll let me keep him safe, or whether you'll take him for the throne." Outside, the first bell of the evening began to toll. Somewhere in the castle, servants whispered about the light in the tower. In the Eastern Territories, survivors of the rebellion dragged themselves through the snow, wondering if mercy was a shield or a trap. And in the frozen darkness between the castle walls and the mountains beyond, something ancient stirred. Something that had been waiting for the bloodline of nightfall to birth a child marked by the power of the Pathfinders. The game had changed. The stakes had risen beyond kingdoms and crowns, and Ezra Nightfall, the Alpha King who had tried to choose mercy, was about to discover what mercy truly cost. I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The healer arrived before dawn, summoned by Ezra's command. She was old, older than old, with eyes the color of parchment and hands that trembled with age or power or both. Her name was Morrigan, and she'd served 3 kings before Ezra's father. She'd also, he suspected, known about this child long before he did. "Show me," she commanded, not asking permission. Sarah stood before her with the resignation of someone who'd learned not to fight the inevitable. The old woman's hands moved across her belly, not quite touching, her fingers tracing the light that emanated from beneath Sarah's skin. When she stepped back, her expression was grave. "Pathfinder blood mixed with Nightfall blood," Morrigan said quietly. "This child will be able to walk the threads of fate itself, to see what was, what is, and what might be, to change the course of kingdoms with a word." "Can she carry it?" Ezra demanded. "Will she survive the birth?" "Yes, but barely, and the child will be different, powerful in ways we haven't seen in 500 years. She turned to face him fully. "You understand what this means, don't you? This child is a weapon. Others will come for it. The rebels you showed mercy to, they'll speak of this. The old families will hear whispers of a Pathfinder heir, and they will move mountains to claim it." Sarah's hand found Ezra's, squeezing once, a question without words. "Is she right?" "Yes," Ezra said, "because she deserved truth. They will, but they won't succeed." Over the next weeks, something shifted in the castle. Sarah was given new quarters, not as a servant, but as something between guest and prisoner, something undefined by the old laws. She ate better. Her body began to round with the pregnancy. But more than that, she began to change the king. She would walk the halls in the evenings, her hand resting on the walls as if reading the history written into the stone. Sometimes Ezra would find her standing in the great hall, staring at the throne. Her eyes would move to his, and he'd see the question there. How do you bear it? One night, unable to sleep, he found her in the library. She was surrounded by books, unable to read them, but running her fingers across the words as if absorbing knowledge through touch. Her gift, her curse. Come here, he said softly. She came, and he took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. This is where I bear it. Here. And now? He moved her hand to her belly. Here. In both of you. She looked up at him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, and he realized she was crying. Truly crying, her body shaking with sobs that made no sound. The tragedy of it struck him then. She could feel everything, express everything. But the world had stolen her voice. He knelt before her, taking her face in his hands. I will give you words, Sarah. Not the ones your throat can't make, but words that matter. I will make sure the entire kingdom knows your name. I will make sure our child knows he was born from love, not violence. I swear it. She touched his face, and in that touch was the story of two people broken by a world that didn't know how to hold them. She shaped a single word with her lips. Believe. But 3 days later, everything changed. A messenger arrived from the north, one of the old families, bearing a white flag but carrying a dagger in his boot. He asked for an audience with the king, and Ezra, bound by the ancient codes of hospitality, granted it. We know about the Omega, the messenger said without preamble. We know she carries a Pathfinder heir. We've come to negotiate terms. There are no terms, Ezra said coldly. She is under my protection. For now. The messenger smiled, and it was a predator's smile. But what happens when your people learn that you've bedded a servant? That you've fathered a bastard on a mute woman of no lineage? They'll call you weak. They'll call her a witch. And they'll demand the child be killed before it can threaten the throne. My people will accept. Your people will rebel. The messenger stood, and Ezra saw something shift in his eyes, a glimmer of foresight, of power he shouldn't have possessed. Unless you choose differently, unless you make her your queen, bind her to you in the old way, blood to blood, soul to soul. Then she becomes legitimate, the child becomes legitimate, and your throne becomes unshakable. Ezra felt the trap close around him. It was brilliant, actually. Make the claim that would save them and sacrifice the very thing that made Sarah safe, her freedom. I need time to consider this, he said carefully. You have until the spring thaw, the messenger replied. After that, we move. That night, Ezra stood outside Sarah's door, his hand raised to knock. He could hear her moving inside, could catch her scent on the air, honey and snow and something wild. He wanted to go in, wanted to tell her everything, wanted to ask her to bind herself to him forever, wanted to protect her by tying her to a crown. But he heard, in the silence of the castle, the echo of that word she'd shaped with her lips. Believe. Believe in what? In him? In mercy? In the possibility that they could find a path that didn't demand sacrifice? He turned away from the door and went to the great hall, where he began writing letters to every corner of his kingdom, preparing them for a truth that would shake their foundations. He was going to marry the Omega. Not because he was forced to, but because he chose to, and he would make sure the world understood why. The first snow of spring came 3 weeks after the messenger departed, which meant the thaw was coming, and so was war. Sarah knew it the way Pathfinders always knew things, through the trembling of threads, through the whispers of fate pressing against the edges of her awareness. She stood in the tower room, one hand pressed against the frost-covered glass, watching the snowflakes fall like prayers that would never be answered. Behind her, she heard Ezra enter. She'd learned to recognize his footsteps, the deliberate weight of them, the way he moved as if the earth itself was bearing him up. He was carrying something. She turned to see him holding a length of silver chain, but it had been transformed. The iron had been polished to a mirror shine, and woven through it were threads of white silk and strands of what looked like starlight. A wedding chain, she understood immediately. In the old ways, when an alpha bound himself to an omega, they would seal the bond with metal and with blood. She shook her head. No. Her hands moved urgently. If we bind, we're trapped. They'll use it against us, against the child. I know, Ezra said, and he knelt before her, holding the chain like an offering. That's why I'm not asking you to bind yourself to me, Sarah. I'm asking you to let me bind myself to you. That's not how it works. No, he agreed, but we're going to change how it works. Because the old ways were made by men who wanted to own women, and I refuse to be that man. He took her hand. Tomorrow, every lord and lady in this kingdom will gather in the great hall. Tomorrow, I'm going to publicly declare that I take you as my equal, my queen, my partner, not as my property, not as a vessel for an heir, as my choice. Sarah felt her heart fragment and reform in the same moment. They'll never accept it. Some won't, Ezra said simply. Some will rebel, and I'll meet them with the same mercy I've always shown and hope it teaches them something. But I have to believe, that there are people in this kingdom who understand that strength isn't about dominance. It's about standing beside someone and saying, I choose you. She wanted to believe him. But the Pathfinder part of her, the part that read threads of fate, showed her other timelines. Timelines where this proclamation led to civil war. Timelines where the child was born into a kingdom tearing itself apart. Timelines where mercy was mistaken for weakness and exploited into ruin. But there were other timelines too. Timelines where love transformed a kingdom, where a voiceless Omega Queen became a symbol of redemption, where their child grew to be a king who ruled with both wisdom and compassion. Sarah reached out and took the chain from Ezra's hands. Slowly, deliberately, she wrapped it around his wrist. Then she took his hand and placed it on her belly, where their child moved beneath the surface, a small flutter of power and life. She shaped the words with her lips. I believe in you. The night before the ceremony, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked the castle corridors, trailing her fingers along the stone, reading the history written into the walls. She felt the weight of generations, kings and queens, victories and failures, mercy and cruelty intertwined like threads of a tapestry that could never be fully unwoven. In the great hall, she found herself before the throne. It was massive, carved from black stone and topped with silver, and it had always looked like a predator waiting to devour anyone who sat upon it. But now, in the silver moonlight streaming through the high windows, it looked different. It looked tired, like all the weight that had rested there had made it weary. She heard a sound, a low, mournful howl from the mountains. One of the wild packs singing to the moon. And something in her answered. Her throat produced the same broken sound she'd made that first day with Ezra, but this time it was different. This time it was a song, wordless, achingly beautiful, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her burned throat. It came from her soul. The howl from the mountains answered, and then another, and another, until the night itself seemed to sing. When the echoes faded, she realized she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the shadows of the throne room, a woman with eyes the color of the moon itself, the goddess, the one who walked between worlds. You carry my mark, the figure said, and her voice was every voice that had ever prayed to the night sky. Pathfinder, voiceless one, queen of the broken and redeemed. Sarah tried to respond, but words still wouldn't come. She could only listen. Tomorrow, you will stand before a kingdom and accept a crown. They will question you. They will doubt you. Some will try to destroy you. The goddess moved closer, and starlight trailed from her fingers. But you were chosen long before this moment. Your voice was taken so that your presence could speak louder than any words. Your silence is the loudest truth this kingdom has ever heard. She reached out and touched Sarah's forehead with one silver finger. Light bloomed from the contact, spreading through Sarah's body like warmth, like recognition. Believe in yourself, daughter of the threads. Believe in your king, and most of all, believe in the child you carry, for he will be the bridge between all worlds. When Sarah blinked, the figure was gone, but the warmth remained, and with it, a certainty that transcended doubt. She was ready. The great hall filled slowly, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. The nobles filed in wearing silks and furs, their faces arranged in expressions of polite curiosity or barely concealed hostility. The rebel lords who'd been shown mercy sat in the back, their chains removed, but their pride still sharp enough to draw blood. And in the highest balconies, the common people of the city gathered, servants, merchants, the ones who usually had no voice in the proceedings of kings. Sarah entered from the side, wearing a gown of white silk that seemed to catch and hold the light. Morrigan had woven charms into the fabric, and Sarah could feel them humming against her skin. Protection spells, truth speakers, magic that would keep her safe from the malice that filled the hall like smoke. She walked to stand beside Ezra, who was dressed in the formal regalia of his station. The long coat of iron-gray fur, the crown of black iron topped with a single silver star. But when she approached, he stood and descended the steps, meeting her halfway as an equal. The hall erupted in shocked whispers. "I gather you," Ezra said, his voice carrying to every corner. "Not to announce a wedding, but to announce a truth. This is Sarah. She was a servant in my castle. She was imprisoned for the crime of being hungry. She was treated as less than human because she cannot speak words." He took her hand. "But she can speak, not with words, but with truth, with presence, with the rare gift of a pathfinder, one who can read the threads of fate itself." He turned to face Sarah fully. "I choose you as my queen, not because you carry my heir, though I am honored to welcome our child into this world. Not because I want to legitimize a union born of violence, though I grieve the circumstances of his conception. I choose you because you have taught me that the strongest thing a king can do is admit his weakness, that the deepest power lies in showing mercy when cruelty would be easier, that redemption isn't about forgetting our sins, it's about choosing to be better than them." He knelt, not in supplication, but in acknowledgement of her worth. "Will you have me, Sarah? Not as your king, but as your partner." The hall went silent. Sarah felt every eye upon her, felt the weight of a kingdom's judgment. She could see the rebellion brewing in the faces of the old families. She could see the hope in the faces of the common people. She could see Morrigan in the shadows, nodding slightly. "Go on," her eyes said. "This is your moment." Sarah released Ezra's hand and stepped back. She began to move, her hands shaping words in the air, the old sign language that the servants had taught her, the language of the voiceless. But as she moved, something shifted. Light bloomed from her fingertips, silver and blue and gold, and the movements became visible. Every gesture left trails of light in the air, and in those trails, the meaning became clear to everyone in the hall. I choose you. I choose this kingdom. I choose to believe that love can transform us. She took his face in her hands, not gently, but with the fierce certainty of someone who had already survived the worst the world could offer, and kissed him. The chain around his wrist blazed with light, and Sarah felt the bond settle into place, not as a lock, but as a bridge. The common people erupted in cheers. The noble houses remained silent, but even their silence had changed. There was uncertainty now. the recognition that the ground beneath their understanding had shifted. One voice cut through the applause. One of the rebel lords stood. "This is madness. You take a servant as a queen? You dilute the bloodline with the power of a pathfinder? You prove yourself unfit to rule." Sarah felt Ezra tense, felt him prepare to respond with anger. But she squeezed his hand and stepped forward. She opened her mouth, and for the first time since her throat had been burned, she tried to speak. The sound that emerged was broken, barely intelligible, but it was audible. It was present. It was real. "I speak," she managed, each word a battle against the scar tissue that had denied her voice for so long. The hall gasped. Morrigan's eyes widened. Even Ezra looked stunned. Sarah pressed on, each word harder than the last, but no less powerful for its struggle. "I am Sarah. I was taken. I was broken. I was given. No choice." She paused, gathering strength. "But I am here now, and I choose. Mercy. I choose. Love. I choose. This king. And if that means this kingdom must face its fear, then so be it." Her voice faded, and she had to sit, exhausted from the effort. But it was enough. The message was sent. She wasn't demanding acceptance. She was offering transformation. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. That night, after the ceremonies had ended and the castle had settled into uneasy quiet, Sarah stood in the tower with Ezra. The spring thaw had begun in earnest, and rain fell instead of snow, a sound like 1,000 whispered secrets. "The child," Sarah said slowly, still working to make her voice function. "Will they accept him?" "I don't know," Ezra said honestly, "but we'll teach him to be worthy of the crown. And more than that, we'll teach him that a crown is nothing compared to the power of choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier." He took her hand. "The threads of fate you read, what do they show now?" Sarah closed her eyes. She could see them, the silver threads stretching into the future. Some led to conflict, some led to peace, most led to something in between, a kingdom learning to evolve, a people learning to accept that strength wasn't about dominance. "They show," she said carefully, "a child born under the sign of the Pathfinders, a king who walks between worlds, a queen who finds her voice." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "They show hope, Ezra. Real hope. Not the false kind. The kind that requires work and faith and the constant choice to be better." He pulled her close, and they stood together as the rain fell, two broken people who had chosen each other, waiting for the future to reveal what redemption truly meant. The winter returned early, as if the universe itself wanted to mark the child's arrival with snow and silence. Sarah's labor began 3 weeks before it was due. The child was impatient, the healers said, eager to enter a world that would be forever changed by his presence. Morrigan moved through the birthing chamber like a ghost, her ancient hands steady as she guided Sarah through waves of pain that felt like the earth splitting open inside her. Ezra waited outside, pacing the corridor like a caged wolf. Kyle, his general, stood nearby with a cup of wine that the king refused to drink. "You're going to wear a groove in the floor," Kyle observed. "I should be in there," Ezra said savagely. "You should be here, bearing witness to your own helplessness," Kyle replied with the bluntness that came from years of service. "That's the lesson, isn't it? The one Sarah taught you. That some things can't be controlled or conquered with strength. Some things just have to be endured." Another scream tore from the birthing chamber, but Ezra realized with a start that it wasn't a scream. It was a word. Sarah was screaming words, his name, over and over, in a voice that had been stolen and reclaimed, a voice that cost her everything, but was no less precious for its rarity. He couldn't stand it anymore. He entered the chamber. Sarah lay on a bed of furs and white silk, Her body arched in the agony of bringing new life into the world. Her eyes found his immediately, and even through the pain, he saw the defiance there, the refusal to break, the determination to birth this child on her own terms. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. "I've got you." She squeezed so hard he felt his bones creak, and he welcomed it. This was her power. This was her strength, not in silence, but in presence, in the refusal to endure suffering alone. The child came with the dawn, arriving as the first light touched the snow-covered mountains. A boy, small but perfect, with eyes that opened immediately and looked straight at Ezra. The child's eyes were neither silver like his father's nor the deep brown of his mother's, but a combination, silver traced with gold, like starlight passing through water. When Morrigan placed the infant in Sarah's arms, the light in the tower exploded like a newborn star. It was gentle, not painful, the same silver and gold as the child's eyes, filling every corner of the room with the promise of new beginnings. "He's marked," Morrigan said in awe, "marked by the pathfinders, by the goddess herself. This child will be a bridge between all worlds," as she said. Sarah looked down at her son, and tears poured silently down her face. She mouthed the words to Ezra, "He is perfect." "So are you," Ezra said, and he kissed her forehead, then his son's. "Both of you." The boy was named Alien, a name that meant starlight between the worlds in the old tongue. And within days, word of his birth had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The rebels came first, not with weapons, but with petitions. They asked to see the child. Ezra brought them to the tower, and when they saw the light that surrounded the infant, the unmistakable mark of the pathfinders, they knelt. Some wept. "Forgive us," one of them said, the same man who'd questioned Sarah's right to the crown. "We didn't understand. We thought you weak, sire. We didn't know that you were strong enough to choose a different path." "I'm not strong," Ezra said quietly, watching Sarah nurse their son. "I'm only trying to be better than I was." The old noble families were slower to accept. Some left the kingdom entirely, unable to bear the shame of a Pathfinder heir who would fundamentally change the balance of power. Others remained, and gradually, grudgingly, came to understand. Alien's birth became the turning point, the moment when the old kingdom died and something new was born. On the night of the spring equinox, a month after the birth, Sarah stood in the tower holding Alien close to her chest. He slept, his small fist curled against her heart. Behind her, Ezra wrapped his arms around them both, and for the first time since she'd been released from her chains, Sarah felt something she'd never expected to feel. Safe. Truly safe. "I had a vision," she whispered. Her voice was still broken, still a struggle, but it was getting stronger. "The goddess showed me. The child will grow to be a king. But he won't rule like we do. He'll walk between the old world and the new. He'll teach people that power and love don't have to be opposites." "That sounds right," Ezra said softly. He pressed a kiss to her neck, to the scar tissue where her voice had been burned away. "You gave him that gift, not just with blood, but with your choice, your refusal to break." Outside, the snow fell on the mountains, and in the distance, the wild packs sang their approval to the moon. A new era was beginning, one where redemption wasn't just a word, but a lived reality, where a king could kneel to a queen, where love could be a strength, where silence could speak louder than any scream. 5 years later, the kingdom had learned to breathe again. The wars had ended, not with conquest, but with understanding. The rebel territories had integrated peacefully into the kingdom, their old families now sitting alongside the traditional nobility. The common people had more voice in the proceedings of state, and Alien, the Pathfinder prince, had begun his training with Morrigan, learning to read the threads of fate and to use that knowledge with wisdom rather than fear. Sarah sat in the great hall, now officially the queen, though the title seemed almost irrelevant. She'd become something more than a queen. She was a symbol, a reminder that transformation was possible, that the broken could be made whole, though the scars remained. Her voice had improved dramatically over the years, though it still carried the roughness of its burning. She used it sparingly, always aware of its cost, but increasingly she chose to use it. A queen who speaks carefully, the people said, speaks with intention. Ezra stood beside her as she held court, no longer the king who ruled from the throne, but the king who stood in partnership. They had learned together that power shared was power multiplied. A petitioner came forward, a young Omega woman, bearing scars on her wrists similar to the ones Sarah still carried. She knelt, and Sarah felt the familiar tremor of recognition. "Your Majesty," the woman said quietly, "I've come to ask. How do we survive when the world tells us we're worthless?" Sarah stood and descended the steps, just as Ezra had done for her all those years ago. She took the woman's hand and placed it on her neck, over the scarred tissue of her burned throat. "You survive," Sarah said slowly, each word deliberate, "by refusing to let others define you. You survive by finding someone who sees your worth even when you don't. You survive by choosing, every day, every hour, to believe that your suffering doesn't own you." She paused, gathering strength. "I was voiceless once. I still carry that silence. But I learned that silence can be its own kind of eloquence. Your scars don't make you weak. They make you a witness to your own strength." The woman began to cry, and Sarah pulled her into an embrace. In that moment, the great hall fell quiet. They were watching redemption in action. They were seeing what it looked like when a broken person helped another broken person stand. That night, Sarah walked with Ezra through the castle gardens. Snow had begun to fall again, not the heavy snow of winter, but the first snow of a new season, delicate and temporary. Alien ran ahead of them, his eyes bright with the power of the Pathfinders, unable to see death in the winter snow, but instead seeing only the promise of spring beyond it. "Do you regret it?" Ezra asked softly. "Binding yourself to me, to this crown, to all of this?" Sarah considered the question. She thought of the dungeons, the chains, the silence and the pain and the years of being invisible. She thought of the moment he'd arrived, the moment his presence had changed everything. "No," she said simply, "but it's still hard. Every day is still hard." "I know," Ezra said. He took her hand, and she felt the chain still around his wrist, the one he'd never removed. The healing is the hard part. That's what most people don't understand about redemption. It's not one moment of transformation. It's 1,000 small choices to believe in something better. Alien turned back to them, his young face illuminated by the falling snow. "Mother, Father, look. I can see all the possible futures the snow might take. They're all beautiful." Sarah watched her son, their son, with wonder and gratitude that still sometimes overwhelmed her. This child born from violence, born into doubt, raised to be a bridge between worlds. He would be better than them, both of them. He would take the lessons they'd learned through pain and build something new from them. She looked at Ezra, and he smiled. Not the smile of a king, but the smile of a man who had found redemption not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to love and be loved in return. "Come," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "Let's go watch the snow with our son." They walked together, 3 figures moving through the white darkness, a king and a queen and a child born of starlight. Behind them, the castle rose against the winter sky like a promise kept. And ahead of them, the threads of fate shimmered with possibility, showing futures that were earned, not given, chosen, not mandated. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything that mattered: presence, choice, and the stubborn, unbreakable belief that even the most broken people could become whole, not by forgetting their scars, but by learning to wear them as proof of survival. In the mountains beyond the castle, the wild pack sang to the moon. And somewhere in the threads of tomorrow, a new legend was already beginning to form, the story of a voiceless queen who taught a kingdom how to listen, and a king who learned that the greatest strength is knowing when to kneel. This is Moonblood Chronicles, where broken souls become crowns, and redemption is written in silver and snow. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.